Hello, I'm Steven Satkiewicz, and this is my presentation, Social Complexity and War from a Big History Perspective. So I want to outline the main arguments of my study here. First off, I just want to initiate the further disciplinary study of the application and potential application of military force, commonly called war, in relations to the emergence and evolution of social complexity in comparative historical and geopolitical contexts. The second major point is that war is both a causal mechanism, that is, it helps further along certain processes of social complexity, but it's also an effect of social complexity. And this kind of blurs cause and effect, which is called reflexivity in a lot of the social sciences. And a very famous phrase that has been coined by the late Charles Tilley: war made the state and the state made war. So it isn't either or, it was both worked together. And this draws upon a lot of research in various fields. My work in civilizational sciences, international relations, geopolitics, military history, grand strategy, complexity science, historical historical sociology, etc. And there's plenty of more room to grow, but this is just a brief outline. Now, one question I have been asked is why social complexity as opposed to other forms of complexity, and more specifically, why human social complexity? I really do like this quote from the late Margaret Archer, who just passed away back in May of this year, but that social reality, because of its human component, is actually has a certain complex dynamic of its own that you will not necessarily see in both the natural world, or as she puts it here, in transcendental reality of the divine. Be that as it will on your own views on that portion, but I think that that's a really important point, and I think in some ways, social human complexity has its own dynamics that can be studied greatly in depth from a big history perspective. Now, with this study of social complexity, I notice a certain tendency for us to try to fit the story of the big history of humanity into this simple linear progression from simple to complex. But I kind of propose, and that has legitimacy in certain contexts, but I do want to propose that maybe social complexity can actually be a study of the different processes, evolution, and emergence of different configurations, dynamics, and connections between not only different levels of social complexity, but also different forms of social complexity. This kind of helps reconcile or helps study both the linear and nonlinear dynamics. That is predictable, relatively predictable, but also very unpredictable, conscious and unconscious efforts that come in play when human social dynamics are at play. And this also allows for a more comparative approach to causal mechanisms, contingencies, configurations across different historical contexts, levels, and even the forms of social complexity. This also gives rise to what I have often have proposed is that we need a multi-paradigmatic approach due to the multifaceted nature of social complexity. This is an influence I've brought in from the civilizational sciences, because paradigms and perspectives, they each have something valuable to say, but they don't necessarily capture the totality of human social reality. And I think in some ways we just have to understand that these different paradigms, they have value, but they also have their limits. So it's best to kind of look at it from multiple angles. Now, I talked about the levels of social complexity. This is just a basic outline of what I would mean by that. You know, the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. And these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list. Obviously, there's lots that can be done. But rather than, for example, like I just said, rather than just trying to position social complexity as the evolution from, say, tribes to states to world systems, uh, maybe we could actually look at it as how do tribes, how do states, and how do world systems, empires, and civilizations, how do they connect? How do they relate to one another over the course of large time scales? Because we're even finding that as early as the Neolithic, uh, even these smaller communities, they still had wide networks of connections with one another, and we're still seeing that that foundation's being done, and archaeology is furthering our research into that. So maybe rather than trying to look for that progression from simple to complex, which does apply to the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, but I think from the Neolithic onwards, we start to see that it's more of the expansion and further complexity of connections and processes that we're seeing here. Now, related to my work on in the civilizational sciences, I've kind of have talked about what I call civilizational ontology, which is kind of related to social complexity, and I'll explain this in a little bit. So, first off, of course, the three main principles of civilizational ontology. First off, civilizational complexity, and that is macro scale social entities are very complex. They have different subgroups and subentities with them. And with number two, intra-civilizational encounters, these subgroups and subentities will internally interact with one another on various levels. This can take both cooperative and antagonistic forms. And this, of course, plays into the main role of war, which I'm going to be getting into. But there's also, of course, intercivilizational encounters, where civilizations on the most macro scale, or social complexity on the most macro scale, if you will, they do interact with one another. And these can take the form of cooperative antagonistic forms, just like the internal counterpart. So, in relationship to war, these are just a few couple examples just from two major ancient history examples, like the ancient Greeks, which is the major Western European paradigm, and then we also have China, which is a very East Asian paradigm. So of course we have the Peloponnesian War, and which I would consider an example of an intra-civilizational encounter. But then you also have the Greek-Persian Wars, which are intercivilizational encounters. And as we can kind of see, we can kind of see how the different aspects of micro and macro and meso level entities and dynamics can be studied in these examples. And we also see this the same in ancient China with the Warring States period, but also we have like the nomadic invasions of China. And of course, it would be kind of interesting also to do a proper comparative analysis of like how does the Warring States period with the various different kingdoms of China fighting for dominance also kind of relate or contrast with the Peloponnesian War, which is another intra-civilizational thing. But rather than kingdoms, it's more city states and alliance systems that are contending with each other. And I think in some ways, rather than trying to fit all this into one simple paradigm, we can kind of see that, of course, contexts do matter. And of course, now we get to war. And in my research on the strategic study of civilizations, we do see that there are different contexts of war and furthermore strategy, which is the planning and challenge and response issues related to war. And of course, Colin S. Gray, one of the great strategic thinkers, noted these different contexts for war that have an impact on war and strategy: sociocultural, economic, technological, military, geographical, and historical. And of course, what I find is interesting, and I want to go here, is that the holistic connection between these factors in strategy and war also kind of are mirrors the same type of factors that go into the study of social complexity. So this, of course, means that social complexity and war can be interconnected and possibly continuations of each other. It's kind of a very interesting twist to Clausewitz's famous phrase, war is a continuation of politics by other means. We're taking it, and that's true, but we're also taking it one step further in how social complexity and war are continuations of one another. And then, of course, I've kind of been examining this possible thing of social complexity as a meta-strategic category. I'm hoping to do that in a future project on what's called strategic history, which I think could be very interesting to study from a big history perspective. Now, a common mistake that we should actually avoid in big history is the common state-centric approach. I know the examples I gave of social complexity earlier were very state-centric, but I think we also need to make room for the fact that in complex social contexts, both historically and even at present, there are both state and non-state actors that are operating within these contexts, and how this relates to these contexts and social complexity is very important. And on a final note, I just would like to end with this very interesting quote by Hugh Smith when talking about the emerging scholarship on the importance of social factors, social complexity and even complexity theory in the study of military history and of war in general. And as he says here, increasingly, however, many analysts of war are now coming to emphasize the social factors in modern conflict: culture, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and the like. War now needs social science as it once needed physics and chemistry. And I think big history would be very interesting vehicle for that, for propelling that type of scholarship forward. And of course, not just modern conflict as Hugh Smith mentions here, but of course the study of conflict throughout much of human history. Thank you.